I would like to welcome everyone to our first Jewish Democratic Initiative online panel discussion for 2020. We hope that you are all well and staying healthy in this new COVID-19 world. The Jewish Democratic Initiative strives for an inclusive South African Jewish community, is committed to social justice, and advocates for a peaceful resolution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The Jewish Democratic Initiative is made up of Jews who not only are not hostile to Israel, but are deeply committed to seeing it flourish, based on universal principles of justice and its own original vision, as outlined in its own Declaration of Independence. It is for this reason that many in JDI are actively opposed to decisions taken in Israel, which harm its own interests, violate fundamental rights, and harm the prospects of peace between Israelis and Palestinians. Though many of our minds have been preoccupied with adjusting to the new realities we have to face, we have sadly had to confront a major potential development in the history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Although the coalition agreement between Benjamin Netanyahu and Benny Gantz is an emergency government to deal with COVID-19, it explicitly allows for the possibility that after the 1st of July, a decision can be taken to annex parts of the West Bank. Exactly how much or what will be annexed is not entirely clear. Some say it will start with settlements such as Ma'ale Adumim on the outskirts of Jerusalem. Others suggest it will include the entire Jordan Valley as well. Either way, any proposed annexation is a game changer. Why? Well, any annexation of territory in the West Bank by Israel represents an attempt by it unilaterally, without any negotiation, to change its borders. These borders have effectively been recognized by the organ of the United Nations with the power to do so, the Security Council. In the wake of the Six-Day War in 1967, in which Israel seized, amongst other territories, the West Bank, the Security Council passed Resolution 242, which required, and I quote, withdrawal of Israeli armed forces from territories occupied in the recent conflict. The resolution was reaffirmed by the Security Council on various occasions, most notably in its Resolution 2334 of 2016, which clarifies and underlines that it will not recognize any changes to the 4 June 1967 lines, including with regard to Jerusalem, other than those agreed to by the parties through negotiations. Security Council resolutions are binding on the international community, and it has effectively recognized that Israel's international borders lie to the west of the Green Line. The principal judicial organ of the United Nations, the International Court of Justice, in its advisory opinion on the legal consequences of the construction of a wall in the occupied Palestinian territories, which I'll refer to as the advisory opinion and may come up in other discussion tonight, confirmed this view of what constituted the territory of the State of Israel and what constituted occupied Palestinian territory. This discussion will seek to consider the ramifications of such a major change in the status quo from a range of points of view, including the legal, moral, security, diplomatic, and political dimensions. At the outset, I want to acknowledge that the Jewish Democratic Initiative, which is convening this discussion, is not neutral in this discussion. We believe that anyone who supports and loves Israel should be opposed to the move to annex parts of the West Bank. Our view is that this is primarily a principled, moral, and legal stance that must be taken. However, importantly, it will also affect all Jews worldwide in its ramifications. Encouragingly, senior leaders in the world community, known as the elders, have recently come out strongly against annexation. And governments across the world are taking notice, including major European leaders have indicated that annexation will not pass without serious repercussions for Israel. And the House of Lords today in Britain requested that there be also acceptance by the government of serious repercussions. In the Jewish community, we have seen a strong response, even from mainstream Jewish organizations and individuals, against annexation. The Anti-Defamation League came out with a clear statement that it opposes West Bank annexation because it says we are Zionists. Organizations around the world, such as Dre Street and Yachad, with whom we are connected, have clearly indicated their opposition to annexation. A former chair of the UJIA in Britain and major donor to Israel, Mick Davis, has warned of the threat the new government poses to diaspora-Israel relations. Thus far, sadly, we have seen a refusal by the British Board of Deputies, as well as the South African Jewish Board of Deputies, to take a position. JDI has itself sent a letter to the South African Jewish Board of Deputies requesting they take a position as supporters of Israel to oppose annexation. We hope these organizations will recognize that in order to be a true friend of Israel, one must exercise leadership at times and actively take a stance to prevent it from making a mistake of this magnitude. We hope tonight to explore with two eminent panelists the impact and effect such annexation will have on Israel, the Palestinians, and the world more generally. And so I'm delighted to introduce our panelists tonight. First, I'm going to introduce Don Futterman, who since 2005 has been Program Director for Israel for the Moderator Fund, a private American foundation which works to strengthen civil society and civil rights and promote democracy in Israel. Don is also the founding executive director of the Israel Center for Educational Innovation, established in 2009, the leading organization for turning around underperforming low-income elementary schools in Israel. And when I was in Israel, he showed me a very impressive book that has been created to help people learn Hebrew, and I highly recommend looking at some of their work. Don is a columnist for Haaretz, and I'm sure many of you know him from the TLV1's Promised podcast, a frank and sometimes hilarious weekly review of politics and society in Israel, which has been named on multiple lists as one of the leading Jewish podcasts in the world. Welcome, Don, and good to have you with us.
Pleasure to be
Our
here.
second guest is Jessica Montell, who is executive director of HaMoked, an organization that assists Palestinians living under the Israeli occupation to address violations of international humanitarian law and human rights law. For 13 years, Jessica headed the Israeli human rights organization B'Tselem. She also functioned as a founding director of CISO, Save Israel, Stop the Occupation, and Israel Diaspora Partnership to build collective action for the 50th year of the Israeli occupation. Jessica, it is a pleasure and honor to have you with us. Thank you for agreeing to address us.
Thanks for having me.
So we are going to start off with a proposed program, and I'm going to ask some questions, and our panelists are going to interact with us. Just a few words before we start. As I said, thank you everyone for doing this and taking away your picture for the time being. If you want to make a comment, you can just type your name into the chat section at the end, and we'll try and do as many as we can. You can also type a question there, and then hopefully we can take some of the questions. We won't be able to get to everyone's questions tonight, but we'll try to do as many as we can. We are also aware that the President of South Africa, Cyril Ramaphosa, is due to address people at 8:30. We would love you all to stay with us. We will continue beyond that time. I know from previous times that it's quite possible to see the address on YouTube afterwards, so you don't have to be there as he addresses. It's put up virtually immediately, and so you can see it after this podcast, after this panel and discussion. And so without further ado, I'm going to begin and first ask Don, could you please provide us with a brief background of how we reached this point where annexation of part of the West Bank is seriously being considered in Israel? Is there popular support for it? And what are the internal Israeli political reasons why it may or may not happen?
Well, there's a convergence or an alignment of multiple forces, and of course—
I think Don needs to be unmuted.
No, I hear him.
Can you hear me?
Yes?
Okay, we'll start again.
Neville, I think Don needs to be unmuted.
No, we hear him.
You can hear me. Let's try again.
I can hear Don clearly. Sorry, Don. I can hear Don clearly.
And I as well.
Okay, so I'll try again and stop me if you're not hearing me. So I think the reason this is happening now is a convergence of multiple forces, some of which are obvious. The most dramatic departure from the past is the policy of the Trump administration. The Trump administration has reversed American policy of decades and essentially adopted a modified version of the Likud as its Israel policy. Today, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo is in Israel, and while he did not highlight annexation as the main reason he's here, it's possible to surmise in either direction that he's giving Netanyahu a message to wait with annexation, or that President Trump wants him to speed up annexation, according to the agreement of the government, which may be sworn in tomorrow. So far, it hasn't been, the preparations are not concluded. They can advance legislation on annexation as of July 1st. And all that the blue and white faction that's part of this government is able to do is to vote against it, but they can't veto that. So Netanyahu would, in theory, be able to get this passed if he decides to advance it. So the other thing is that if we look historically, there's always been a lobby. There's always been a settler lobby pushing for annexation. That's nothing new. In the past few years, past 5 years, there's an organization that's devoted itself more or less exclusively to this subject, Tnuat HaRibonut, the sovereignty movement. And I don't want to exaggerate their importance, but when you have a group that's pushing one item to keep it on the agenda, at least within internal circles, in right-wing circles, and settler circles, that puts the issue front and center. And I think they did that effectively. There's a lack of restraints right now. In the past, there's usually been the American administration to rein in Israel's expansionist aspirations. So now we have an American administration with the opposite view, or there was some pressure from the European Union. And one of the things Netanyahu has done quite effectively in the last few years is divide the European Union. So he has the support for these aspirations and these plans from, we might term them Eastern European, or some of the aspiring autocrats, such as Hungary's Viktor Orban, who are allied with Netanyahu, and they will support this move. In addition, there's some precedents. You know, the Trump administration recognized Israel's annexation of the Golan Heights, and nobody really cared. Most Israelis didn't even notice that it happened, not to mention the annexation of East Jerusalem long ago. This situation is very different, and the implications, the consequences are much more severe and risky, but there are precedents that you can make these kind of moves and not pay much of a price or any price for it at all. I think that's something that they're counting on. The left itself set a precedent 20 years ago when it abandoned the 67 borders as the sine qua non for negotiations and started talking about including the settlement blocks. So already those borders were negotiable, and including settlements became part of the discussion, even in most of the left. So I think all of these things play a role. Diaspora Jewry right now for Netanyahu has less weight and less significance than his allies in the evangelical community in the United States, who of course are the core of the support for President Trump. Now, this is not a small group. It's 90, 100 million people, and they are very much in favor, with a very, very few marginal exceptions. They are very excited about this idea of Israel annexing parts of the West Bank. So if Israel doesn't see the consequences, and they see a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, I think that's why it's on the table right now. Now, the other clock that's ticking is the clock until American elections in November, which is less than 6 months away. And because of the disastrous handling of COVID-19 and the astronomically high number of fatalities in the United States, and the damage to the United States economy as this epidemic is damaging, or pandemic is damaging the economies all over the world, Trump is much more vulnerable than he seemed just 2 months ago. So I think Netanyahu sees this as maybe the opportunity, which will, if Trump loses, that opportunity will disappear. And Netanyahu has already kind of thrown diaspora Jewry and bipartisanship under the bus in the last few years. So again, personally, for his vision, the price is not high. I'm sure, Jessica, you'll talk about the response on the Palestinian side and the Palestinian street. When people talk about what might happen here, possibly violence would break out, but most Israelis are not worried about that very much. Jordan might cancel its peace treaty. Again, most Israelis not losing much sleep over this. Is there popular support for it? I would say perhaps the most shocking aspect of this is the widespread indifference to this entire discussion. People have been locked in their homes for the past 2 months in this country. We locked down very early and very stringently, and there's been plenty of time for people to be talking and obsessing about different issues and politics, and this is not one of the issues. This has not registered. This is a historic change in Israel's policy, and obviously, we'll talk about it as we go along, a huge effect on the possibility or the end of the possibility for a two-state solution. But Israelis have been involved much more with whether or not Netanyahu would form a government, whether the courts would stop him, how Benny Gantz betrayed the left or the center, and most of all with dealing with coronavirus. So people are distracted. Only this week did you start to see even articles and mention of this issue. And of course, with Pompeo, surprisingly, this is the Secretary of State of the United States, who is supposed to be on his own lockdown regimen in the United States, jumps on a plane and comes to Israel today. He's saying the annexation is not his top priority on this visit, but that may or may not be the case. So I think, why people don't care. A lot of Israelis don't believe it's going to happen. They don't think that this really will move forward. In a recent poll, 52% of Israeli Jews favored the annexation, but I don't get a sense that they're passionate about it, that they care that much. And also, if they think it would happen, they don't think very much is going to change in their lives. Most Israelis are fairly apathetic about the occupation. They're comfortable with managing the conflict and the framing of that issue as managing the conflict, the way the right wing has been trying to reframe the debate for the last decade. That's kind of become conventional wisdom. Every act of violence from the Palestinian side is seen as more proof that the Palestinians can't be trusted. And our media and most Israelis don't pay any attention to the violence on our side, which sometimes triggers those violent acts. The stories are covered in an extremely one-sided and partisan way, which feeds all of that. Add to this all the collapse of the left. We don't have an active left that has a strong voice, and this last decision by Benny Gantz to break up his left-center coalition kind of was the death knell of the left as we know it. If we have time, we can talk about that later. That might not be only a bad thing. There might be some silver lining in that change, but it means that there's no strong opposition who anyone is paying attention to. Will Netanyahu move forward and to tell him to hurry it up? He will do it because again, he wants to. If he decides he's going to do it, he has to do it before the American elections, because he has to be worried about Joe Biden getting elected, and Joe Biden would oppose this. Although Joe Biden also is not likely to impose harsh sanctions on Israel. If Netanyahu wants to back out, as my colleague Anshel Pfeffer wrote in Haaretz last week, Netanyahu is usually a very cautious man. He doesn't like to take unnecessary risks. If he decides that it isn't worth the risk at this time, he has a fall guy. He can blame it on Benny Gantz. He can tell the right, I was going to do it. It was my dream. I was going to fulfill all of your fantasies, but I'm saddled with Benny Gantz, and then he'll start blaming everyone and their brother and the courts and the legal system and the conspiracy against him for preventing them from fulfilling the vision of Greater Israel. I will say, I think he's going to move forward on this.
Okay, thanks a lot, Donna, for that really, in a nutshell, but very multiple factors in the internal political discussion. I want to now bring in Jessica. And Jessica, annexation is not just a political question, but raises a number of legal issues. Perhaps let's just start with some basics. I laid out the foundation for thinking of the Green Line as Israel's border. Accepting this, why would it be illegal for Israel to annex territory it conquered in the Six-Day War?
Well, first of all, hello, and I'm really glad to be here, and thank you for having me. The sort of basic principle of the UN Charter, the post-World War II era, is the illegality of territory acquired by force. That's a customary legal principle applicable to everyone. And then, the significance of it is not only what it means for Israel and the Palestinians and our conflict. The international legal system is based on respect for that system. We don't have a police force to be enforcing every violation in the world. So every violation of international law then is undermining the system for everyone. And for that reason, let's say the European Union is very firm, not only because of their commitment to the two-state solution, because of what that means for, other places where other countries have sanctions against Russia for the occupation of Crimea, other places where states have territorial aspirations using force to acquire territory. So, that basic principle has to be reinforced for the good of the international system as a whole.
Yeah, and it's probably why the international system is not going to ignore it, as maybe hoped by some, but because it actually reinforces a wider principle which affects many, many other territories. Continuing in this vein, annexation that's a pure international law principle about how countries relate to one another, but annexation is also being opposed on the legal front, not just because of its consequences on borders, but also on people. And so I know your organization works strongly with Palestinians and their human rights and actually sees firsthand some of the violations of humanitarian law and human rights law that take place in the occupied territories. What would the effect of annexation be on Palestinian human rights?
So it's clear that annexation is not going to be good for Palestinians. Of course, it very much depends what we're talking about, what actually is being annexed. And there's a wide range. The coalition agreement between Blue, White, and the Likud does not specifically say what we're talking about. So you had some, very extremist politicians talking about an annexation of all of Area C, that's 60% of the West Bank. You have the Trump plan, which is something like 30% of the West Bank. Probably that would be the maximalist position at this point. I don't think there's any way they would try to be annexing more than the Trump plan calls for. So you're talking about either this 30% of the West Bank or the Jordan Valley, which is, a large strip of territory, the whole eastern border of the West Bank, or a few settlement blocks. I mean, again, it depends whether Netanyahu wants some symbolic annexation, as you said, Ma'ale Adumim, or some other settlement, or a much larger. It's clear that the goal will be as much land as possible with as few Palestinians as possible in the annexed area. So then you're talking about concerns. I mean, you have concerns about the people who will be annexed and the people who will not be annexed. Both of those populations, their rights are liable to be violated. And you have questions about the land involved. So if we're talking about some Palestinians who will be annexed, are they going to be full citizens of the state of Israel? Are they going to apply this model like we see in East Jerusalem, which was annexed right after 1967? And there, Palestinians nominally have the right to apply for Israeli citizenship, but it's an extremely difficult process. The vast majority are permanent residents of the state of Israel and not citizens, which is in some ways a privileged status compared to Palestinians in the rest of the West Bank, but is also a vulnerable status, and they don't have full participation in decision-making of Israeli government authorities. So the population in the annexed area, the question is what will be their rights and their legal status, but also the population of the whole West Bank. You're talking about, if it's the Trump plan, then some sort of Swiss cheese of the West Bank carved out into these areas that will be annexed to Israel. A big question is the land in those areas. All of the settlement blocks have privately owned Palestinian land in those areas. If those areas now become part of the state of Israel, what is the ownership of that land? Is that land being confiscated from their owners? Even if it's not confiscated from their owners, will Palestinian farmers have access to their lands? Now you have to go, they will need a permit to enter Israel to farm their own farmland. So you have a lot of questions around land ownership and access to land. And then freedom of movement throughout the whole West Bank. Again, you're talking about this sort of Swiss cheese. People, to get from one village to another, now may have to cross through Israel. You need a special permit to enter a foreign country just to go, a few miles down the road, because now you have a little strip of Israel crossing through, and also access to Jordan. If you're talking about annexing the Jordan Valley, and most of the plans talk about the Jordan Valley. And one of the rationales for annexing the Jordan Valley is to sever the link between Palestinian territory and Jordan. So then, that's the only transit artery for Palestinians to travel abroad. And certainly their ability to be traveling abroad is liable to be restricted even further if there is annexation. So there's a lot of questions because there's no actual plan for the annexation, but there's no way to think about annexation in a way that is not going to very severely compromise, a whole range of human rights issues. But then I would add, the macro picture. If you're talking about the right to self-determination for the Palestinian people, as we, the state of Israel and the aspirations for Jewish right to self-determination. Of course, annexation then is making that even more remote. The idea that you could have a viable Palestinian state, annexation, if there is a first successful annexation, it's more likely to lead to more. It's not going to be a one-time, small territory, but it would be laying the ground for further annexation. And then you're talking about, sort of a permanent situation of lack of self-determination for the Palestinians. I mean, you could call, let's say Donald Trump calls that the state of Palestine, right? What's left over from the Swiss cheese that is being annexed. But, in this context of South Africa, and when I was there were a lot of questions about similarities between the reality in Israel and the West Bank today and apartheid South Africa. I mean, this framework of Bantustans under apartheid, that you could call it an independent state, but in fact, it doesn't function like one, and the people living there do not genuinely have rights to self-determination. So, from the littlest issues to, the big picture, the human rights concerns, I think, have to be central when we talk about annexation.
Thanks, Jessica, for that overview of the fundamental rights concerns. I also wanted to ask Don here at this point if he wanted to have any thoughts on the effects of annexation on Palestinians.
You have to unmute him.
Yeah. Neville, please unmute Don.
Okay, now I'm unmuted. Well, yes, I think it's likely to make the situation worse. I don't see how it could improve their standing, and it will just perpetuate the lack of a resolution to the conflict. So I think, Palestinian rights are very much not on the mind of most Israeli Jews. I'm not sure how much they're even on the minds of Palestinian citizens of Israel anymore. I think Israeli Jews have grown inured or numb to the situation. It's not that it doesn't get covered in the media, it does appear in the media, but people just tune it out. So I think if we just have annexation that doesn't lead to what the Trump plan is calling for, a long-term plan for a Palestinian state, which could be delayed endlessly according to the conditions that are included in that plan, or negotiations for 4 more years, which would end in failure, then their situation is likely only to decline.
And Don, perhaps you can, following on from that, and Jessica may want to come in afterwards about that, what do you think the effects will be on Israeli democracy of annexation? Does it undermine, in some sense, the notion of Israeli democracy? And also we know that there have been a lot of attempts to undermine a number of institutions in Israel in furtherance of the rights project. Do you think that will continue and deepen?
Well, look, there's a couple of ways of looking at this. I mean, for one thing, it's, Gidon Levy has written that the annexation, some other people have agreed with him, the annexation will end the pretense that Israel is a functioning democracy for all the people under its control, or its now would also be under its direct sovereignty. And he argues that the occupation was always intended to be permanent. I don't agree with that. I think there was a moment when we could have ended it, and we didn't. It didn't work in the 90s. And that's a long story why that didn't happen. Will this destroy Israeli democracy? Well, in some way, Israeli democracy is now being weakened, or I don't think it's dying yet, but it's certainly being weakened by 1,000 small cuts. The courts have already been weakened. We have an autocratic leader who has just secured himself a lifeline for several more years, and possibly till the end of his political career, because even were he to be convicted, Netanyahu is able to keep appealing those convictions, and these things tend to take a long time in the courts. The Shabak has been granted greater powers of surveillance because of the COVID-19 crisis. It's easy to suspect that those powers of surveillance will be used, or in fact, they're already being used against Palestinians in the Palestinian territories. I think that we have to look and say that the two-state solution is something that may or may not be dying in front of our eyes. I mean, when you hear the condemnations of the annexation plans, most people are saying this will sabotage or weaken the possibility for a two-state solution, but there has been no actual progress towards a two-state solution in a long time. So there is no peace process. There hasn't been a real peace process for years, even if you consider the negotiations led by then Secretary of State John Kerry. Those negotiations seem to be designed to fail. Certainly, Netanyahu sent in a team that he knew would not be able to come to a resolution. It doesn't mean there might not have been a moment even in those negotiations, something might happen, but it didn't. So I think, what's shocking to me is after 4 decades of mostly right-wing rule, after 11 years of Netanyahu's rule, after all his attacks on democracy, which most Israelis who are not his hardcore supporters see very clearly are designed to protect his own, his own future, save his skin so that he won't have to do prison time like Ehud Olmert, the former prime minister, had to do. I think people see that, and still only around half of the Israelis, Jews who are polled, favor the annexation. So I think the appetite for this is not huge. Israeli democracy is under assault. It's been under assault certainly for the last several years, since the whole process of filing criminal charges against Netanyahu were there. It's gone into a much higher gear. But if you read Michael Svard's book about the High Court and the occupation, you realize the High Court did not step in for decades to weaken the settlement enterprise. And there was one word that was always used, and I think it's going to be used in this case too, to neutralize almost all opposition, and that word is security. As soon as you say security concerns, people stop listening to the rest of the conversation, and I think that will take place here as well. So is this bad for Israeli democracy? It's terrible for Israeli democracy, but we've already been administering an occupation for more than half a century, and Israel's democracy will likely be an imperfect democracy, an ethnocracy in some situations, and a totally not a democracy in the way that it rules the lives of Palestinians, as it hasn't been all this time.
So maybe,
Jessica, Jess, do you want to come in and add on?
Yes. I would agree with what Don says. And I think for many years, Israelis thought that they could maintain the distinction between democratic Israel and military rule in the West Bank over the Palestinians, that green line was a firm, border of democracy. with the expansion of Israeli settlements in the West Bank, already you had two populations living side by side, governed by two different legal systems. Israeli settlers enjoying all the rights and benefits of the Israeli democracy, with a lot of added privileges in terms of financial investment in the settlements that we don't receive in our neighborhoods inside Israel, right next to their Palestinian neighbors living under military rule. So that's a corrosive situation for a democracy in any case. And again, for years, we didn't see those corrosive effects on us, let's say Jewish Israeli citizens. Now, when you see the restrictions, the attacks, the efforts to be limiting the High Court, both because of Netanyahu's corruption charges, but in fact, they started earlier than that. When the High Court had the audacity to rule against the settlers, you suddenly had this backlash of efforts to restrict the High Court. Ayelet Shaked, as Justice Minister, that passed legislation removing powers of the High Court. There are threats to pass laws that there would be a way to override High Court rulings that go against, the settler lobby or other things that constituency opposes. So those are ways. And then, Don gave the example also of the security agencies, which have always been maintaining surveillance and, violating the privacy of Palestinians. We take for granted that they should not be doing that. They don't have the right to be doing that to us. And now, the COVID-19 crisis then has been exploited to enlarge these powers. The idea that almost all of the measures used to be fighting the COVID-19 crisis are defense emergency regulations, right? Something that doesn't exist in almost any other country. Every other country would have to, actually pass laws or issue regulations, or within the framework of democratic systems. You can't be issuing emergency regulations, which on a whim can be issued with very little scrutiny and oversight. So, these are the ways that I think we have a creeping sort of occupation eroding the Israeli democracy up until now. But it's clear that any annexation would only accelerate that process. And then you also have to think about the other, when I was in South Africa last year, again, the idea about whether the apartheid analogy holds for Israeli rule in the West Bank. And the main reason that analogy up till now has not held is because of the framework of occupation as a temporary framework. And of course, the words of many Israeli governments and the deeds on the ground, you have a lot of contradiction between that. But still, up until recently, the rhetoric of temporary presence, temporary military rule over the Palestinians, that eventually there should be, a two-state solution, self-determination for the Palestinians, territorial compromise, that weakened or erased the claims that the reality is an apartheid reality. Once you have annexation, which is, permanent, then it is much harder to say that the reality is not apartheid. And the question will no longer be whether the reality in the West Bank is an apartheid reality. The question is whether Israel as a whole, all of the territories under Israeli control, the current state of Israel and the West Bank, then that's the same regime. If you are annexing parts of the West Bank to Israel, Israeli law applies. The status of those territories is identical to Israel. It's much easier to make the claim that, in fact, that entire reality fits the legal definition of an apartheid reality.
Yeah, I want to say I think that many people in South Africa are a bit nervous about the usage and of the analogy, and also see that there are significant differences between the situations. The legal definition of apartheid also does actually refer to specifically racial categories, which is in some jurists argue that it can be extended. But nevertheless, I think the worry, whether we use it or not, is the treatment of two populations in different ways, one having political rights and one not. and that would be, whether or not you call it apartheid, it would be a significant violation of fundamental rights. Would you agree with that?
I think it's, I don't like using the term apartheid for the reasons that you just said, David, because of the racial origins of apartheid, which most people outside of South Africa are very hazy on what apartheid actually meant. They know just the distinctions between black and whites, if not that there was anything more complex to it. But this is where, you know, I think we have to ask in our camp, how are we supposed to respond to this? You know, I think for a long time, what was left of the left or the liberal democratic camp, and even just now, as this new government that may come into formation tomorrow, if not probably on Sunday, even as this was forming, a lot of people were waiting for the courts to save us. And I think that strategy has proven to be a very self-destructive one. We have not been winning or making our case in the court of public opinion. We have not been swaying people over to our side and reminding them why this occupation is so destructive. We've seen the campaigns against groups like the one Jessica used to lead, B'Tselem, against Shavrim Shtika, breaking the silence, trying to demonize them, anyone who criticizes the occupation in any effective way, as enemies of the state. So we need to find ways to respond to this much more effectively. I think most Israelis, when they hear the doomsday messages that are offered along with the people who are arguing against annexation, just don't believe them. They don't believe that those doomsday threats are real. They don't believe there will be any sanctions against Israel. They don't believe that there will be any security threats to Israel. They don't think Jordan is going to go to war against us, or that the Palestinians are going to launch another intifada. So they mostly think that nothing much is going to change. And for most Israeli Jews not living in the territories, who are not settlers themselves, nothing will change. So I think we have to find out an entirely different way to deal with this issue and to respond to it. You know, some people I know are saying we should call their bluff and say, okay, you are moving us towards one state. What next? What does that look like? And force them to say, we want to have two different statuses of citizenship. We want to, you know, force them to put some plans on the table, which then could actually be discussed. I don't know if that's an effective tactic either, but obviously what we've been trying has not been successful.
Don, one thing that I wanted to pick up on what you said about the court saving, just one more thought, question for you can pick it up, or Jessica. Obviously, many people will have followed that the court had to decide on whether Netanyahu could assume the position of prime minister given his indictment. The court had previously ruled, just for people to know, as I understand it, that a minister in the government may not serve if they are under a trial or under indictment, but they effectively refused to make the decision here that this applied to Netanyahu. Do you think this is a significant failure of the court in this instance?
Look, I don't think it's a failure. I'm not happy that this is the way it all played out, but I would say I'm much more disappointed or frustrated with Benny Gantz and his attempt to become a national leader than I am with the courts. I think the courts was in a no-win situation. For one thing, they claim that they made the decision completely according to the law, that the law did not prevent Netanyahu from forming another government even while under indictment. He has to be presumed innocent until proven guilty. And looking back at the records when that law was decided about ministers not being able to serve if they were under indictment, the issue of a prime minister actually came up. That's what they said. And so the precedent or the rule itself didn't lead to that direction. I think the courts also were the victims of a very systematic campaign that Netanyahu has been leading against the courts. He appointed Amir Ohana, who is one of his attack dogs, a henchman who has no real political credibility other than he's there to serve Netanyahu's will to become the justice minister, and with an Ayelet Shaked for her own agenda, promoting the settlement agenda, worked actively to weaken the courts. But there was a very concerted campaign to frame the issue that the courts are trying to defy the will of the people, that the voters chose Netanyahu to lead. Of course, it didn't even get 40% of the, or 33% of the vote. So, you know, and they don't vote for a prime minister, you vote for a party. But the message was that the people of Israel have chosen Netanyahu to lead them, and the courts were going to undermine that decision. Therefore, the courts are the ones who are undermining democracy. So it's very clever. He's not the only one to take this tack. It's being done elsewhere in the world. And the court said, we are ruling just on the merits of the law. They asked for some changes in the government agreement. Some of those changes were made basically on the spot from one day to the next. And the courts stepped back and said, this is not our place to intervene, although they left themselves the leeway that they might challenge some parts of this coalition agreement later once the government's actually sworn in.
Jessica, do you want to come in? Was this a green light for annexation by the court? I think you are muted at the moment. Neville, please unmute Jessica. Thanks, great. Neville, please unmute Jessica.
I'm trying to unmute her. I'm just trying to find her now. She disappeared. Hold on. There, I got you, Jessica. Just 1 second. Okay, you should be unmuted in a moment.
Yes,
there you go.
Here I am. You know, I would say Don mentioned Michael Sfard's book on the High Court of Justice, and you know, their rulings, certainly when it comes to occupation,